For years, the self-made myth has been the bedrock of the American promise. The story goes that if you work harder than the person next to you, if you save diligently, if you make the right choices, the system will reward you with wealth, security, and a better life for your children. Coaches repeat it. Politicians swear by it. It's the story we tell ourselves to make sense of the gap between the penthouses and the paycheck-to-paycheck existence. But when you actually trace the numbers, when you open the family ledgers that span generations instead of a single career, you don't end up where the story promised. You end up at a different mechanism entirely, a mechanism that has been operating, quietly and legally, for over 200 years, a mechanism that separates the permanently wealthy from everyone else. Not through intelligence, not through grit, but through a set of rules written by the people who already held the gold. What if the real path to wealth was never something you could learn in a classroom or a seminar? What if the blueprint was sealed before you were born? The year is 1815. The Battle of Waterloo is about to change the map of Europe. But in London, there is a man who understands that the real battlefield is not the muddy fields of Belgium. It is the floor of the London Stock Exchange. Nathan Rothschild has built a private courier network that moves faster than the official government dispatches. He knows Wellington has won before the British government does. He stands on the exchange floor, sells his government bonds, and watches the entire market panic and follow his lead. Prices collapse. Then, when they hit bottom, he buys everything back at pennies on the pound. By the time the official news arrives, he has multiplied his fortune many times over. That moment is often taught as a story of financial genius. But the lesson is not about genius. The lesson is about information asymmetry. Rothschild won because he had access to data that was deliberately kept from everyone else. He understood the single most important rule of accumulating wealth. The person who controls the flow of information controls the flow of money. Why do the same families stay wealthy across generations? You have been told it is about smart investing, about discipline, about passing down good habits. But when you look at the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, a different picture emerges. The data shows that inheritance is the single strongest predictor of net worth. Not education, not career success, not even income from work. The top 1% hold roughly $30 trillion in wealth. The bottom 50% collectively hold about $2 trillion. That gap is not closed by any amount of frugality, any number of side hustles, any degree of financial literacy. The gap is structural. Now overlay the intergenerational earnings elasticity data from the U.S. Census Bureau. This metric measures how strongly a child's income is predicted by their parents' income. In the United States, that elasticity is approximately 0.5. In practical terms, more than half of your economic position is determined before you take your first breath. The country that markets itself as the land of opportunity has some of the lowest social mobility in the developed world. The mechanism is not a bug, it is a feature. Stop and look at the timeline. In the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate was over 90%. Union density was around a third of the private workforce. A single income could buy a house, a car, and a vacation. The post-war era was not a golden age of morality. It was a specific set of policy choices that compressed the wealth gap. Then, starting in the late 1970s, the rules began to change. Marginal tax rates were cut. Unions were broken. Financialization replaced production. And the wealth share of the top 1%, which had fallen to single digits, began its steady climb back to the levels of the Gilded Age. Who wrote the rules that keep you out? The answer is not a single person. It is a system of feedback loops that has been refined over 2 centuries. The estate planning industry exists to ensure that wealth passes intact across generations. The stepped-up basis loophole allows capital gains to escape taxation at death. Trusts and shell companies obscure ownership. Lobbying expenditures map directly onto legislative outcomes that favor capital over labor. The mechanism is self-reinforcing. Wealth buys access. Access writes rules. Rules protect wealth. Here's what changes your understanding entirely. Andrew Carnegie wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth in 1889. In it, he argued that the rich have a moral obligation to distribute their surplus for the public good. Carnegie built libraries. Rockefeller funded universities. This philanthropy is celebrated as generosity. But look at the mechanism more closely. Philanthropy does not redistribute power. It does not change the underlying rules that concentrate wealth. It is a pressure valve that releases just enough social tension to prevent the system from being questioned. The library you borrowed books from as a child was funded by the same fortune that was built on the backs of workers earning pennies per day. Now watch what happens when you apply this lens to the present day. The Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting is often called the Woodstock of capitalism. Warren Buffett speaks for hours about investing principles. People pay thousands of dollars to hear his wisdom. But Buffett himself has stated repeatedly that his biggest financial advantage was being born in the right time and place, in a country with the right legal framework during a period of unprecedented economic expansion. His advice is sincere. It is also impossible to replicate for someone starting from a different position. This is the part most people miss. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and the modern equivalent, they all understood the same principle. The game is not about working harder. It is about owning the board. The tax code, the financial regulations, the inheritance laws. These are the squares on the board. And the players who have been sitting at the table for generations have had 200 years to arrange those squares to their advantage. If you have ever worked a 60-hour week and still watched the numbers not add up, you know the silent anger that comes when the promise clashes with the paycheck. That anger is not a personal failing. It is the natural response to discovering that the rules were written by someone else, for someone else. But the discovery itself is a form of power. That recognition that the board has been arranged before you ever sat down is exactly what the players at the top count on you never discovering. If this kind of unflinching look at how the game actually works resonates with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next pieces of the map we are laying down together. And drop a comment telling me which square on the board, the tax code, the inheritance laws, the financial regulations, has felt most tilted against you in your own life. But before we go deeper, ask yourself, how many times have you heard the same advice from people who have never actually done it? The suggestion that you should just invest more, save more, work more, as if those actions could overcome a structural gap of $30 trillion. That is the first sign of the game. We will unpack what the real players knew in a moment. Stick with me. The average millionaire has 7 streams of income. That statistic appears in countless blog posts and seminars. It is presented as a roadmap. Diversify your income, and you too can join the club. But look at what the statistic actually means. The average millionaire does not earn their wealth from labor. They earn it from assets, real estate, stocks, businesses that operate without their physical presence. These are not streams that can be built on a salary. They are streams that require initial capital. And initial capital, more often than not, comes from prior generations. The Federal Reserve data reveals something uncomfortable. The wealthiest 10% of households hold over 70% of all privately held stocks and mutual funds. The bottom 50% hold less than 1%. When the stock market rises, the rich get richer. When the economy grows, the benefits flow upward. Capital income grows faster than labor income. This is the central finding of Thomas Piketty's work, and this gap has been accelerating since the 1980s. Now apply this to your own life. If you are earning a wage, you are trading time for money. Time is finite. Capital, on the other hand, can work 24 hours a day without getting tired. It compounds. It avoids taxes through favorable rates. It inherits without penalty. The game is not rigged by accident. It is rigged by design. And the design has been optimized for over 200 years. The Rothschild network of couriers in 1815 was the beginning, but the modern equivalent is faster and more invisible. High-frequency trading algorithms move money in microseconds. Private equity firms extract value from companies they strip and sell. The hedge fund industry charges 2 and 20 for barely beating the market. And all of this is legal. All of this is normal. What happened to the one person who cracked the code? There are stories, of course, people who started with nothing and built fortunes. But the data shows that these are outliers, exceptions that prove the rule. For every rags to riches story, there are thousands who played by the rules and ended up in the same place they started. The self-made millionaire narrative is a myth that serves a purpose. It keeps people striving. It keeps them blaming themselves. It keeps them from looking at the board and asking who painted the squares. This is where the pattern becomes undeniable. You are seeing the blueprint now. I want you to take a breath and let this land. Because what comes next is the part they burned every copy of. The mechanism is not evil. It is not a conspiracy of mustache-twirling villains. It is a system of incentives that has been optimized by the people who benefit from it. The tax code is written by lobbyists. The financial regulations are influenced by the financial industry. The education system teaches the myth of meritocracy because it is cheaper than teaching the reality of structural inequality. And each generation inherits not just wealth, but the rules that protect that wealth. If you have made it this far, you are not just watching, you are ready to see. The ones who always knew the score are the ones who stop blaming themselves and start seeing the mechanism. That is your move right now. So where does that leave you? Not with false hope, not with cynicism, but with a choice. You can continue playing the game on the board as designed, hoping to be the exception. Or you can understand the shape of the board and decide what game you actually want to play. The Rothschilds did not build their fortune by working harder than everyone else. They built it by understanding how information flows, how rules are written, and how capital compounds. You do not need to replicate their fortune, but you do need to see the pattern. You felt it, did you not? That moment when the promise clashed with the paycheck. You are not imagining it, and you are not alone. I have compiled the proof in a single document, the missing chapter they scrubbed from your onboarding, and I am sharing it with the ones who always knew the score. Comment receipts below. I will send the link. The system is not broken. It is working exactly as redesigned, and the next upgrade cycle is already underway. The question is whether you will learn to see it coming. The Rothschild pattern repeats in every era, just with different tools. In the 1920s, it was insider trading pools. In the 1950s, it was the 3-martini lunch where deals were sealed over cocktails in private clubs that had no black members and no women. In the 1980s, it was the leveraged buyout, where a small group of investors could take a company private, load it with debt, pay themselves massive fees, and walk away while the company collapsed under the weight of the borrowing. In the 2000s, it was mortgage-backed securities, packaged and sold to pension funds, while the originators knew the loans were garbage. Each era produces a new mechanism. The mechanism always does the same thing: transfers wealth upward, from the many to the few, while the narrative insists that the system is fair and that anyone can win. The structure of the mechanism is worth examining in detail. It has 3 layers that work together like gears in a clock. The first gear is the legal framework. This includes the tax code, property laws, inheritance rules, and financial regulations. The second gear is the financial infrastructure. The banks, the stock exchanges, the private equity firms, the hedge funds, the family offices that manage wealth for the ultra-rich. The third gear is the cultural narrative, the myth of meritocracy, the self-made man, the idea that wealth is earned and poverty is deserved. These 3 gears are not separate. They are connected. The legal framework is shaped by the financial infrastructure through lobbying and campaign contributions. The financial infrastructure benefits from the legal framework, and the cultural narrative prevents the majority from questioning either one. Consider the carried interest loophole. This is a provision in the tax code that allows private equity and hedge fund managers to treat a large portion of their income as capital gains rather than ordinary income. Capital gains are taxed at a lower rate. The result is that someone earning $50 million a year can pay a lower effective tax rate than a teacher earning $60,000. That loophole has been in place for decades. Congress has debated closing it many times. It never happens, because the people who benefit from it also fund the political campaigns of the people who would need to close it. But the carried interest loophole is just one example. The stepped-up basis loophole, which we mentioned earlier, allows heirs to avoid paying capital gains tax on inherited assets. If your parents bought a house for $50,000 and it is now worth $1 million, their heirs can sell it and only pay tax on the gain that accrues after the inheritance. The gain that occurred during the parent's lifetime simply vanishes from the tax system. This single provision costs the federal government tens of billions of dollars in lost revenue every year. And it overwhelmingly benefits the wealthiest families who pass down stocks, real estate, and businesses worth millions. Here is the part that should make you stop. These loopholes are not obscure. They are not hidden in fine print. They are publicly documented. They are debated in Congress. They are analyzed by economists. And they remain in place because the mechanism is designed to protect itself. The same people who benefit from the loopholes are the same people who write the checks that keep the politicians in office, who maintain the loopholes. The pattern is staring us right in the face. The loopholes are not secrets. They are open secrets, kept alive by the very people they enrich. If you want to keep seeing these threads pulled, subscribe. Because this channel exists to trace the invisible wiring that most people never notice. And right now, drop a word in the comments. Tell me what you'd call a system where the rules are public, the damage is known, and nothing changes. I'll meet you there. This is not a left-wing or right-wing phenomenon. Both parties have participated. The tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 under George W. Bush disproportionately benefited the wealthy. The tax cuts of 2017 under Donald Trump did the same. Under Barack Obama, the carried interest loophole remained untouched. Under Joe Biden, the infrastructure bill included tax breaks for cryptocurrency investors. The mechanism does not care about party labels. It cares about maintaining the flow of wealth upward. Now look at the educational system. If the game were truly about merit, you would expect the educational system to be the great equalizer. Study hard, get good grades, go to a good college, get a good job, build a good life. That is the promise. But the data tells a different story. Children from families in the top income quartile are dramatically more likely to graduate from college than children from the bottom quartile, even when they have the same test scores. Legacy admissions give preferential treatment to children of alumni. Donor families buy their children spots at elite universities. The college admissions scandal of 2019 was not a deviation from the norm. It was a glimpse into the actual system, where the wealthy use their resources to secure advantages that are invisible to everyone else. And it is not just admissions. It is the entire ecosystem. Private tutors, test preparation courses, enrichment activities, internships arranged through family connections, the network of alumni who open doors for their own. By the time a child from a wealthy family enters the workforce, they have accumulated advantages that no amount of extra effort from a child born into poverty can overcome. The game is over before it begins. The Federal Reserve study on intergenerational mobility measured something else that is rarely discussed. It found that the children of the top 1% do not just inherit wealth. They inherit the knowledge of how the system works. They learn which schools to attend, which careers to pursue, which social networks matter. They learn the unwritten rules. This is the invisible inheritance, and it may be more valuable than the money itself. What happened to the one person who cracked the code from the outside? There are stories that circulate in business magazines and motivational speeches. A single mother who built $1 million business from her kitchen table. An immigrant who arrived with nothing and became a tech billionaire. These stories are held up as proof that the system works, but they serve a different function. They are the exceptions that allow the rule to persist. For every one of these stories, there are millions who worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much, and ended up in the same position they started. The mechanism depends on these stories. It needs people to believe that the system is fair, so that when they fail, they blame themselves rather than the structure. Self-blame is the most efficient form of social control. It requires no police, no violence, no legislation. It simply requires that people internalize the narrative and turn their anger inward. But you are no longer inside that narrative. You are standing outside it, looking at the mechanism for what it is. That changes everything. The fear of losing everything is also a control mechanism. The threat of poverty keeps people in jobs they hate, in relationships that drain them, in lives that feel small. The mortgage, the car payment, the student loan, the credit card debt, these are not just financial obligations. They are the chains that keep you in place. The mechanism is not just about wealth accumulation. It is about stability maintenance. It is easier to control a population that is afraid of losing its fragile foothold. But here is the inversion that the mechanism does not expect. Once you see the board, once you understand the rules, you can begin to play a different game. Not the game of trying to beat the system on its own terms. That game is rigged. But the game of designing your own board with your own rules, on your own territory. There is a reason that wealthy families invest in real estate, in private businesses, in assets that produce cash flow, without requiring their physical presence. It is not because they are smarter. It is because they understand that capital is freedom. Freedom from the wage, freedom from the boss, freedom from the stock market, freedom from the fear of losing everything. They are not trying to maximize returns. They are trying to maximize autonomy. 40 years ago, the average CEO earned about 40 times the average worker. Today, that ratio is over 300 times. The mechanism has not just transferred wealth upward. It has transferred power. The CEO can decide where to locate the factory, whether to automate the jobs, whether to outsource the labor. The worker has no say. The mechanism ensures that the one with capital makes the decisions, and the one without capital follows them. Now watch what happens when you zoom out. The stock market reaches new highs. Corporate profits break records. The economy grows. But the real wages of the bottom 90% have barely budged in decades. The gains go to the top. The mechanism is not a bug in an otherwise fair system. It is the system. It was designed this way, layer by layer, year by year, generation by generation. Remember what the Rothschilds understood in 1815. Information asymmetry is the foundation of wealth. But information is not just about knowing the outcome of a battle before anyone else. It is about knowing how the system works. It is about understanding that the tax code is not a neutral set of rules, but a battlefield where interests collide. It is about seeing that the financial industry is not a service industry, but an extraction industry. It is about recognizing that the meritocracy myth is not an innocent story, but a weapon used to justify inequality. The mechanism is not evil. It is a machine that does what it was designed to do. The question is whether you will continue to feed it with your labor, your time, your hope, and your blame, or whether you will step back, see the shape of the machine, and decide to build something else. That something else does not have to involve millions of dollars or complex financial instruments. It starts with a shift in perception. It starts with understanding that the problem is not you, that the game was not designed for you to win, and that your energy is better spent building your own game on your own terms than continuing to play a rigged one. The ones who always knew the score do not spend their time complaining about the system. They do not spend their energy trying to reform it. They understand that the mechanism is too deeply embedded, too well defended to be changed from inside. Instead, they build parallel structures. They create businesses that do not rely on the banking system. They acquire assets that produce cash flow independent of the stock market. They build networks of trust outside the corporate hierarchy. They play a different game. And the first move in that game is the simplest and the hardest. It is to stop looking at the promise and start looking at the mechanism. It is to stop blaming yourself and start seeing the board. It is to stop asking how you can earn more and start asking how you can own more. The mechanism has been operating for 200 years. It will not disappear overnight. But once you see it, you can no longer be controlled by it. The fear of losing everything loses its power when you understand that you were never truly holding anything that belonged to you. The crack in the promise is where the light gets in. You have seen the crack. Now the question is what you build on the other side of it. The historical record is littered with people who saw the mechanism clearly and tried to warn others. There was the farmer who watched his neighbors lose their land during the railroad expansion of the 1870s, understanding that the government land grants were not about development, but about transferring public wealth into private hands. There was the factory worker in the 1920s who realized that the company store and the wage system were designed to keep workers perpetually in debt, never able to save enough to leave. There was the steel mill employee in the 1970s who watched the plant close and move overseas, recognizing that the loyalty he had given was a one-way street. Each of these people saw the same pattern. They saw that the system was not designed for their benefit, but they were isolated. They had no language to describe what they saw, no community to validate their perception, no framework to turn their observation into action. The mechanism depends on that isolation. It depends on each person believing that their experience is unique, that their failure is personal, that everyone else is somehow making it work. But you are not isolated anymore. You have the language now. You have the framework. You have the data that confirms what you suspected all along. The question is, what you do with it. Consider the alternative to the mechanism. Imagine a system where the tax code did not reward wealth accumulation, but rewarded productive labor. Imagine a system where inheritance was taxed at rates that prevented dynastic wealth from concentrating across generations. Imagine a system where the financial industry served the real economy instead of extracting value from it. These are not utopian fantasies. These are policy choices that have existed in other countries and in other eras. The United States had a 90% marginal tax rate in the 1950s. Germany has strong labor protections and worker representation on corporate boards. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund that shares oil revenue with the entire population. The mechanism is not inevitable. It is a product of decisions made by specific people at specific moments in history. But here is the uncomfortable truth that the mechanism does not want you to consider. The changes that would make the system fairer are not going to happen through the political process as it currently exists. The same mechanism that concentrates wealth also concentrates political power. The people who benefit from the current rules are the same people who fund the campaigns, lobby the legislators, and write the regulations. The feedback loop is too tight. The door is locked from the inside. This is not a call to despair. It is a call to clarity. If the political path is blocked, then the path must be built elsewhere. And the foundation of that path is the shift in perception that we have already begun. The mechanism has a weakness. It depends on belief. It depends on people believing that the game is fair, that hard work will be rewarded, that the system will eventually work for them. If enough people stop believing, the mechanism loses its power. Not because the rules change overnight, but because the people who were supplying the energy for the machine stop showing up. They stop overworking. They stop judging themselves for not having enough. They start redirecting their energy toward parallel structures that the mechanism cannot control. This is already happening in small ways. The rise of remote work is a crack in the corporate hierarchy. The growth of online communities is a crack in the information monopoly. The increasing skepticism toward traditional institutions is a crack in the narrative. These cracks are small. They are fragile, but they are real, and they are growing. The mechanism has responded, of course. It always does. Corporate wellness programs were designed to co-opt the dissatisfaction. Diversity initiatives were designed to suggest that the system could reform itself. Financial literacy courses were designed to place the blame back on the individual. Each response from the mechanism is an attempt to absorb the dissent, to redirect it back into the existing structure. But the mechanism cannot absorb what it cannot recognize, and it cannot recognize a person who has stopped asking for permission. A person who understands that the board was not designed for them and who decides to stop playing that game entirely is invisible to the mechanism. It has no category for that choice. It does not know how to control someone who has opted out of the narrative. This is the quiet revolution that the mechanism does not see coming. It is not a march. It is not a protest. It is not a political campaign. It is a million individual decisions made by people who have seen the shape of the board to redirect their energy towards something that actually belongs to them. What that something is, no one can tell you. That is the point. The mechanism tells you what to want. It tells you what success looks like. It tells you what you should be striving for. The liberation comes when you decide for yourself what matters. When you stop measuring your life against the metric that was given to you. When you start building according to your own design. The 40-acre farm that the railroad took is not coming back. The factory job that moved overseas is not returning. The pension that was looted by corporate raiders is not being restored. But the land under your feet, the relationships you build, the skills you develop, the autonomy you carve out for yourself, these are things that the mechanism cannot take because it does not even know they exist. The Rothschilds understood information asymmetry, but information asymmetry works both ways. The mechanism does not know what you value. It does not know what you are capable of building. It does not know that you have seen through the promise, that you understand the cost of continuing to play its game, and that you are ready to design your own. The mechanism thrives on one final deception. That knowledge alone is enough. That once you see the pattern changes. It does not. Perception shifts nothing on its own. The worker who understands the wage system still needs to pay rent. The farmer who sees the land grant scheme still needs to feed their children. The steel worker who recognizes the plant closure for what it is still needs to find another job. Seeing the board does not change the position of your pieces on it, but it changes your next move. The difference between a person trapped in the mechanism and a person who has escaped it is not wealth. It is not education. It is not connections. It is the understanding that every choice you make either feeds the machine or starves it. Every hour you give to a job that drains you is energy supplied to the mechanism. Every dollar you spend on things you were told to want is fuel for the engine. Every minute you spend comparing yourself to the curated lives of others is a surrender of your own measure. The alternative is not to drop out of society. It is to re-enter it on different terms. To work for money, but never work for meaning. Keep those separate. To acquire assets that produce freedom rather than status. To build relationships that are not transactional. To measure your life by the only metric that cannot be manipulated by the mechanism. The degree of autonomy you have over your own time and attention. The Rothschilds built their fortune by controlling information. You build your freedom by controlling what you let matter. The mechanism wants you to believe that your value is determined by your net worth, your job title, your consumption. It wants you chasing a finish line that moves every time you get close. It wants you exhausted, distracted, and convinced that the problem is you. You are no longer convinced. You have seen the board. You understand the rules, and you know that the only game worth playing is the one where you decide what winning means. The mechanism will continue to operate. It will continue to transfer wealth upward. It will continue to tell the story of the self-made millionaire to millions of people who will never become one. But it will no longer have your belief, and without your belief, it cannot control your choices. That is the quiet victory. That is the crack in the promise. That is where you begin. The mechanism fears one thing above all else: a person who has stopped asking for its permission. A person who wakes up in the morning not wondering how to make more money, but wondering how to own more of their own life. A person who looks at the inheritance data, the tax code, the lobbying feedback loop, the education system, the meritocracy myth, and says, "I see. Now what am I going to build on ground they do not own?" That ground is smaller than you think. It is the hour before work that you spend learning something that does not lead to a promotion, but leads to a new skill. It is the conversation with a neighbor that builds trust outside of any corporate structure. It is the decision to measure success, not by the thickness of your portfolio, but by the depth of your autonomy. These are not compromises. These are the first bricks of a foundation that no inheritance law can touch. 200 years ago, Nathan Rothschild stood on the floor of the London Stock Exchange and understood that the flow of information was the flow of power. Today, you stand at a similar threshold. You have the information now. You see the shape of the board. The question is not whether you will win the game as it was designed, because that victory was never available to you. The question is whether you will leave the table entirely and build your own. The mechanism has no answer for that choice. It has no algorithm for a person who stops chasing the finish line. It has no control over someone who has redefined what victory means. And that is the one thing it cannot absorb, co-opt, or redirect. That is the crack that cannot be sealed. Do not wait for the system to change. It will not. Do not wait for permission. It will never come. Build your board, define your game, and let the mechanism wonder where you went.